Europe's digital economy is not merely a marketplace. It is a governance system shaped by regulation, infrastructure, and strategic dependencies. What has become increasingly clear in 2026 is that one of Europe's most persistent vulnerabilities is not physical, it is institutional. Its reliance on U.S. big tech for core digital infrastructure, cloud services, and platform ecosystems. At first glance, this looks like a market outcome. American companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta dominate the cloud, operating systems, search, advertising, and social platforms. European businesses and governments adopted these services because they were efficient, robust, and globally interoperable. But institutional design is not just about efficiency. It is about control, resilience, and strategic autonomy. And here, Europe's architecture has not kept pace with its ambitions. The problem is structural. Critical digital functions, data storage, cloud computing, AI hosting, digital collaboration tools are provided primarily by foreign platforms. These platforms are subject to U.S. law, governance norms, and geopolitical priorities that do not always align with European ones. Under U.S. statutes like the Cloud Act, data controlled by U.S. firms may be accessible to U.S. authorities even when that data resides physically within Europe. This exposes European states and businesses to legal, economic, and strategic risk. This reliance was manageable when transatlantic relations were relatively stable, but rising tensions from disagreements over trade, data flows, and geopolitical alignment have exposed the fragility of assuming continuity in those relationships. European officials are now candid that reliance on U.S. platforms creates vulnerability. If access to cloud infrastructure, search, or digital supply chains were suddenly restricted, the economic shock would be profound. The institutional response has coalesced around a concept that in European policy circles is now ubiquitous: digital sovereignty. This is the idea that Europe should be able to govern its own digital infrastructure, data flows, and platform markets not as a defensive reflex, but as a structural redesign of how the digital economy is governed. But digital sovereignty is a contested term. For some, it means building European alternatives to U.S. cloud and AI infrastructure. For others, it means designing governance frameworks, regulations, procurement rules, and public investment that reduce dependence without severing ties to global technologies. The underlying institutional question is this: is Europe a consumer of foreign technology or a proprietor of its own digital ecosystem? Europe's existing regulatory architecture already reflects parts of this answer. Laws like the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act aim to impose obligations on dominant platforms, including U.S. firms, to ensure fair competition, interoperability, and accountability within the EU market. These laws are designed to reshape the incentives of platform behavior, not just in Europe but globally. Yet regulation alone does not build sovereignty. It governs the behavior of providers who are external to the political and technological ecosystem Europe wants to nurture. To genuinely reduce dependency, Europe needs industrial and infrastructure strategies, investment in chips, cloud, AI research, and data infrastructure that can compete at scale. Programs like the European Chips Act and emerging strategies for AI funding illustrate that recognition. These initiatives aim to strengthen supply chains and create capacity within the EU that is not immediately contingent on foreign platforms. There are signs of concrete action. The EU and some member states are exploring sovereign cloud solutions where data can be stored and processed under European legal control. Open-source commercialization strategies are being drafted to make European software ecosystems commercially viable and integrated. Proposals such as the EU Sovereign Tech Fund aim to sustain critical open-source components that undergird digital infrastructure. However, building digital autonomy is expensive and slow. Some estimates put the cost of establishing a self-sufficient cloud and digital infrastructure at trillions of euros. That is not just a fiscal burden. It is an institutional burden because it requires coordinated industrial policy, cross-border investment, workforce development, and long-term strategic planning. The political economy of this transition is complex. Some industries and governments worry that a push for sovereignty can become a form of protectionism that isolates Europe economically. Others argue that full decoupling from U.S. platforms is neither possible nor desirable, given the interconnected nature of digital markets. Europe's digital strategy thus oscillates between strategic autonomy and deliberate interdependence, a governance design that seeks to retain openness while reducing asymmetric dependencies. A key institutional insight is that sovereignty here is not absolute control. It is capacity and optionality, the ability to choose between providers, govern data locally, and mitigate geopolitical risk without systemic disruption. It is a shift from passive consumption of foreign digital infrastructure to active participation in global digital rulemaking. This transition also raises questions about competition and innovation. If Europe limits itself to its own digital stack, it risks underinvestment in cutting-edge technologies that require scale and global integration. On the other hand, remaining dependent on external providers can hamper strategic autonomy, regulatory priorities, and data protection standards that Europe has codified in laws like the GDPR. The transatlantic dimension adds another layer. U.S. firms argue that digital sovereignty can function as a trade barrier or regulatory fragmentation, hindering innovation and market access. European leaders counter that sovereignty is not anti-innovation. It is a governance approach designed to create a more resilient and competitive digital ecosystem where European firms can thrive, and where regulatory priorities reflect European, social, and democratic values. Between these positions lies the institutional friction. Digital markets are global, but governance architectures are national or regional. Europe's digital strategy reflects a fundamental tension in modern economics, the tension between efficiency through integration and resilience through autonomy. Europe's reliance on U.S. big tech was not chosen by accident. It was the product of historical patterns of investment, regulatory regimes, network effects, and the path dependence of digital adoption. Changing that dependency will not happen overnight, and it will not be cheap. But the recognition of that dependency and the choice to address it structurally signals a shift in how digital markets are governed. Digital sovereignty is not an end state. It is a political and economic design project. It asks, who gets to define the rules of digital infrastructure? Who owns the data? Who controls the platforms that shape daily life, commerce, and public order? In the era of digital interdependence, autonomy is not isolation. It is governance, a future where Europe can choose its digital architecture rather than having it chosen for it depends on how these institutional mechanisms are designed, funded, and implemented. And that is the real strategic challenge facing Europe in a world where digital power is geopolitical power. For continued institutional analysis of how technology, governance, and economic power intersect, subscribe.